Everyone else mute their, yeah. Okay. So, hello, and I'm Payal, and I'm chairing this speaker series for ISSIP. Today's topic is horrors and heroes of building design capabilities in organizations. And our speakers are Marzia and Alexandra from Livework. I will hand the conversation now to them. And if anybody has questions, please feel free to add as they go in the chat channel. Once they are done with their talk, I will read out the questions one by one and ask Marzia and Alexandra to answer them for everybody. We are also recording this live, and this will be uploaded later on the ISSIP website. So over to both of you.
Thank you. So thank you everybody to having us here with you today. My name is Marzia. I am lead service designer at Livework. My background is in design, but I have a PhD in organizational studies. And here next to me is my colleague Alex.
Yes, I'm Alexandra. I'm also a service designer at Livework Rotterdam, and I have a background in product design. I studied at Polytechnico, and then I moved to the Netherlands where I studied the strategic product design at TU Delft, and I've been working at Livework for a few years now, and I'm happy to be on board.
Cool. For those of you that do not know Livework is the very first service design agency that actually started in the world. It was founded in 2001 in London. Since then, we've been working with a whole range of clients across almost 21 sectors, running a whole diverse range of projects, but they all fundamentally look at how to use design to help organizations either deliver better services, so improve the service, or completely rethink the service they deliver to their clients. And increasingly more in the last, I would say, 4 to 5 years, we're now involved in more strategic work that looks at how to use design to transform organizations into more customer-centric companies. And so today, the topic that we're going to cover is exactly that. So it's sharing a bit of our approach and thinking on how those transformation happens. How can you help organizations become more customer-centric by design? And we have developed a bit of an approach to this type of work. So I'm going to talk briefly about our model and our approach, and I'll be thinking about that. And then we're going to share 2 case studies, one from a German telco and another one from a US-based investment bank, on what does it actually mean to move from theory to practice, and what happens when you actually enter these organizations and try to do that in real life. So the way we think about developing design capabilities is really looking at 3 main pillars. The first one is about developing service design foundations. And the way I talk about that usually is almost imagining like building plumbing for design to happen in an organizational setup. It's really building the infrastructure for design to be able to operate. The second pillar is around projects. So it's proving in practice what design can do through contained projects that look at a side of the experience, either the customer or the client's experience. And the third is about learning and training and coaching, both as service design trainings, but also coaching in projects, so that the understanding and awareness of service design can grow in the organization. Lastly, what is that you eventually want to do is to make sure to translate all of that so that it permeates business as usual mechanisms. And so if we, today we're a bit where all the development of design capabilities happen. And the way we think about that is across a number of pillars. And I'm going to quickly run through them just for you to get an understanding of what kind of work we do at that level. The first one that you see on the left is customer vision and strategy. So one of the very first things that we do in organizations when we start this kind of transformations is really to understand, what is that we're here to do. Is it a question of customer centricity? Is it a question of client centricity? Is it a question of bringing the customer the core, but for what reason? What is the case for change for us to do that? And what is our strategy? So how to get there? And so that gives a bit of a perspective of what is that you're trying to achieve. The second thing is around the mindset. So it's really trying to embed a customer-centric culture. And that, I mean, in our experience, happens through 3 levers. The first one is ensuring that you have senior sponsorship that can really not only fund, but also sponsor and promote certain initiatives. It happens through communication and engagement, so really having a clear engagement plan for different stakeholders across the organization, and then having an HR strategy that can actually look at the way you reward people, the way you assign bonuses and things like that. And the design governance piece is about how do you actually run design the organization, where does the design team sits, which department, how is that team connected with the rest of the organization. So one of the most important pieces here is really to understand the plugins, how design plugs into the rest of the organization, all the different departments that you have to work with. Then there's a piece around the design practice, so really making sure that there is an understanding of what design stands for in terms of principle, the human centricity, the transformative power of design, but also more the practice of running prototypes and conducting customer research. The next piece that we look at is insights and measures. So how you actually measure client experience, but also how do you measure the validity of this approach. And so here you find things like a continuous insight portal. Can you build a centralized place where all the insights about the customer experience can be collected, and how do you ensure that you have the right metrics to look at that in a meaningful way. There is then a whole pillar around implementation, and that looks really at improvement projects that are small projects to make sure that service delivery is up to date, but it also looks on the other spectrum at very large projects that look at change, right? Change implementation. And then finally, the last bit is really business as usual. That's really about getting to the grit of the operational excellence. So how do you empower your people? How your processes actually controlled and clear, and the deployment of technology and data that should be at service of that overall process and experience.
Yes. So as we said before, we would like to talk you through 2 cases. So these are 2 projects that we're working on. They're very different, but very similar to some extent. So they're all about capability building. The telco, German telco, is a bit of a smaller, and is again a bit of a smaller project, while the investment bank is a much longer and larger and more, let's say, thorough project. The German telco has the headquarters in Cologne. It has 20,000 plus employees. It does have a CX department, which since a few years, and yet it's still kind of difficult to assess the design maturity of such departments. And the initial question that they came to us with was, how do we bring a customer centricity and customer experience perspective in the new processes? So they're going through an operational transformation. They're also trying to, let's say, achieve more operational excellence. So they're changing the way of doing things. And what they asked us is, how do we bring the customer perspective inside the process? So our entry point was indeed operational efficiency. It was a team that sits within the IT department of the organization, so separate from the business side.
The other case that we chose is this investment bank who has headquartered in New York. They employ about 270,000 people globally. So just they have 50,000 people technology center. Just to give you an understanding, like Google as a whole is 90,000 people. So it's quite a large beast, quite a different setup than the telco. They have an established UX function. UX design is actually understood to enable digital product development. They are now just starting to experiment with service design, and so they came to us asking us, how do you do that? How do you establish a service design practice that can actually be relevant in a context like ours? And at the moment, we're working with two very different lines of business. And the entry point that is basically operations in one. And in the second line of business is digital, so it's a more tech perspective.
Yes, so starting from the German telco, let's say the starting point was the goal, the target, that what they asked us to help them with was improving the use of customer experience and centricity in the development process, generally creating more awareness of customer experience in the IT department, so spreading that throughout the larger bit of the organization, and helping to bridge business and development, so using customer centricity as a way of aligning business and development, creating a common language, and generally spreading CX knowledge within the organization. So you have to consider that all of this was to be done in a few months. So I think it was around 2 to 3 months. So what we were interested in sharing with you is, like what we planned and how actually things went, because between what you decide to do and all the theory that you decide to put in practice and the actual practice, there's there can be a gigantic gap. So for example, our initial planning was to, dive a little bit in their organization, understand what they needed, and then the core of the project would have been creating some CX interventions within their development process and piloting them with teams. So this is a little bit what the intention was. But what happened is that in the reality of the fact, they had an ongoing merger, which caused a lot of inertia. So we spent most of the time literally hunting for teams that would be up to be our guinea pigs for trying these CX interventions. So that was a bit of a trying to make room for actually creating an impact. So that was one thing. Another thing was there was great enthusiasm. They are extremely, let's say, excited people to work on CX implementation, but they do lack a long-term vision. So when you start to talk about foundation, when you start to talk about the plumbing and the let's say the infrastructure that goes behind it, they kind of lack that sensitivity to understand and to act upon it. So it's just they tend to stay on a project level and in doing things a bit like running around like headless chickens. So really how can I say this, pinning them down and telling them, okay, let's build a long-term plan is something that takes quite a lot of energy. So another thing was that they have this philosophy of do and ask for permission later, which caused a bit of this sort of very scattered organization. So a lot of people having a lot of different roles and being involved in a lot of different initiatives. And at the same time, because of the merger, things were very slow, and there were a lot of people with a lot of time on their hands, and these sessions that we had became huge, and there was a lot of people involved, which was unexpected, and it created a bit of a drag, and it was kind of difficult to conclude from that.
All right. What happened in the investment bank was quite different. So we had an agreement for 2 years. So we had a plan actually for 2 years. And this is the first year plan that I'm showing here. And at the beginning, we thought, okay, so there are 6 things that we really want to cover, which really build on the model that I shared before. So at the beginning, we want to make sure that we have a clear mission, a clear business case, and we want to make sure that we really nail down some of the service design principles and operating model, how we're planning for developing this thing. And we're going to run it, we have a concept phase, and then we have a prototyping phase, and then we're going to go into first use, test, and then second quarter, we're going to start, mapping out the end-to-end experience and start looking at metrics, and then we will start looking at tools. So shared reusable standards, let's say, so that everybody has one central place that, and everybody is aligned on the kind of tools that we're using. And then we're going to start thinking about governance and how to govern those service architecture. And then eventually we will think about a research, continuous research portal, a centralized place where to hold all this client information. Then after a few weeks, this is what it became. So although everybody agreed at the very beginning that, yeah, we need a mission and vision, there is the reality of, you know, quite a sum of money being invested for this thing to start, and having senior sponsor being very quickly, very itchy, wanting to see tangible things straight away. So the reality is that we basically had to start all of it at the same time, because they were asking quite quickly, immediately, certain pieces of the puzzle that were not planned till later on. And so the way we reconstructed this story is really around the two horizontal axes that you see at the top, so client centricity by design, which fundamentally represent our mission here, that we articulated very quickly at the very beginning, and then kept validating while we were running, and an operating model for design that actually looked at the way, as I said before, the way design plugs into the rest of the organization. And then we developed 3 pillars that looked at, the first one was instrumented journeys, so looked at a visual representation of the end-to-end client experience. This is something that in the entire bank was not existing. So within each of these line of business, there was no one single department or person that had a view of the end-to-end experience of the client. And so we started doing that, and underneath that started defining all the key journeys that represent that story. And this piece of work very quickly moved into what are the metrics that can actually help us assess the health of the service and prioritize what are the service stages that should be looked at going forward. So how do you prioritize projects within this end-to-end view? And so very quickly we move into a definition of a potential governance model. So we started talking about 2 levels, a level 0 that really lives at a life cycle level, so the end-to-end life cycle, including all the possible services that the organization offers within that line of business, and start thinking about a group of people, a council that could govern that and own that level 0, high level life cycle, to prioritize projects that has to be developed, basically. And so we call that prioritization process activation of a service stage. So in a moment in which the group decides that, for example, we see here deciding whether, you know, working with you or not as a client has priority versus anything else, then they assemble a team. That team starts running a service design project. That project has a level 1 council that looks at the way that project is developing and whether that piece of work is actually bringing back some of the expectations and the outcomes that were defined. And so this is initial governance models that we started to craft and then prototype on a very small scale to start, you know, looking at, you know, who are these people, and is this a meeting, and is this a meeting that it actually build on existing routines, or is a completely new routine? Because fundamentally what you ask these people to do is to have people from very different parts of the organization in the same room to prioritize projects that look at, you know, 3 or 4 very different backlogs and align the view so that we push one view, one priority across all these different teams, which is asking them to do things in a very different ways than they've been doing before. And then the third pillar that we start to very quickly build is the one reusable standards. And to be honest with you, I'm historically very against to give any template to anyone in the organization at the very beginning, because what happens when you do that, you know, you run a service design training or a design thinking training, whatever it is, and then you give a template to someone and they start ticking boxes, right? So they build a persona, they start ticking boxes, they don't even speak with a customer, you know, just cut corners, and that becomes a bit of a mix of things that is not really useful. But because a whole number of service designers have been hired while we started this piece of work, so there were a whole bunch of designers in the US, in the UK, in Hong Kong, in India, that were hired at the same time to actually run projects. So the whole project, proof projects bit that I showed you before were actually in their hands. That reusable standard centralized bank was fundamental to make sure that the work that all these new people that were developing was aligned, basically. And they had one language, one visual. And so we started building very quickly a library of toolkits and methods for them to use. And the idea with that is that this is at the moment built for the service design community to use, but eventually there will become a centralized place where everybody from different parts of the organization can just go and learn about how to use a Blueprint, for example. So in this story, I guess one important thing is like the human component, right? So from theory to practice, the human error is what actually happens, right? And so examples of that are, overload. None of this is these people's full-time job. I mean, the people that we work with investment bank, they have 3 full-time jobs, actually covering 3 completely different roles. So they probably have 20% of the time to actually do that, right? At the same time, they're really putting their career at stake because they are actually asking quite some money from the organization. They are promising quite some things to the organization. So at the same time, it's very important for them, for these things to happen in a certain way. And people enter in panic mode depending on what that conversation with that person, how did that go? They give random responses. They struggle to manage their team because designers are not great at managing other people, to be honest with you, in my experience. And that is both down and up. Managing your team, but also managing your boss and their expectations, and what is that they go around telling to other people. And also duplication of work. I mean, in an organization with 270,000 people, I can ensure you that are going to be at least the 3 teams in random places that are doing exactly the same thing, and you will never know. And then after a year, you will actually discover that actually happened. And so some of the things that we saw working is, split the, this is mastodon thing, an elephant really piece of work. So splitting in smaller tasks, working in 2-week sprints, prioritize the kind of work that you're developing and making sure that you have tangible things enough to keep momentum and keep people interested. Tailoring strategies to make sure that those people are involved very early stage and you can, bring them in your tent, basically. Building reflection moments, most of the time I really feel like a therapist. Some of these teams call me just cry at the phone, just venting time, because it's hard. It's hard work. Nobody understands what you're doing there. And you just, you are in a set, organization that is simply not set up to work that way. And so these are some of the things that we know worked. To conclude, I think, this is it's a list that we actually put together at the very beginning of this program with Investment Bank. When we actually wrote the proposal for this piece of work, we said, these are the 8 things that will go wrong. And I can assure you that all these 8 things will happen. And actually, we reviewed this list last week, and all of these 8 things actually happened. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that, you have to deliver value in the short term in order to keep the momentum. But, you got to design this thing using a realistic pace, right? It's a balance between short-term and long-term value. Picking wrong and early bets. So choosing that proof projects at the very beginning, just because there was an opportunity there, or that guy had some money, and there was that relationship, and it's just not the right project to actually prove the things that you want to prove. Blurry accountability, not being clear who's the ultimate call and priorities and design decisions. Losing sponsorships, these sponsors that are funding this piece of work is CO -2, right? So these people are at the same time investing in design and in AI and a whole bunch of other things. They very easily get distracted. So that is a thing that you should totally keep in mind. Change congestion, so is the inability to recognize other existing initiatives in the organizations and competing for fundings with those. Difficulty in articulating the value that you bring, and also having to deal with cultural discomfort. It's like, this is uncertain, this is new, nobody's seen it before. There is no real best practice case that you can bring, on the value of design. There are some reports, one organization that can say, and this is the the experience that we've been through for 7 years, this is what happens, this is lesson learned, and then you copy paste. And it's not one size fits all, basically. And so this is some of our learnings.
And we're done.
And we're done. 25 minutes, 5 minutes late.
No worries. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If anyone has any questions, please feel free to type out in the chat channel.
Payal, I wonder if, given that the group is fairly small, we can just ask our question.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Sure, sure.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marzia and Alex. Great presentation. My question is going to be a little bit strange because it's something we struggle with at ISSIP. How do you distinguish really this as a service design versus a human-centered design project? What makes it a service design, these projects? What makes them a service design project in your view?
It's the business and organizational lens. So any service design work for sure starts from a client perspective, but effectively has to bring business value and has to work within an organizational context. So if you're not more than plugged into that context and more than aware of what the bank is there for and what is that they're effectively trying to achieve, the old client human centricity bit just is not relevant. Nobody wants to hear that. So I think that the key that defines this approach as a service design approach is that three perspectives, right? Is yes, bringing the human perspective in it, which is the client, which is the employee as well, right? A lot of these employees have a very difficult life in this bank, but it's really making sure that you deliver business value and they ensure that the organization can actually deliver on it. And that might mean that some of the outcomes are not perfect, are not great. I mean, some of these things are not how I would do it in the ideal world, but they just work within the place, and so that's what gotta be. Because sometimes good enough is just what you need.
Okay, that's really great. Yeah, thank you.
I have a question regarding the processes. So you also mentioned that, when you are starting a project and you plan around it and the reality is very different from that. So how do you navigate around the hindrances that are created sometimes by the processes? And how do you align the teams?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch the question. Can you repeat?
Yeah, sure. So when you start a project and planning a project in the initial stage versus you were talking about the planning and the reality, and often the reality is very different from when you begin a project and you plan it with like the correct processes and everything. So how do you navigate around the hindrances that are caused by the processes and that are caused by sometimes planning itself?
Well, I mean, as I said before, you need a plan at the beginning because you need to show that you know what you're talking about, right? And that's a thing. And then you agree on a set of deliverables at the end of the process. Like, you're going to be at the end of this first year at a point where you'll be able to do that, right? Then everybody knows that in the moment in which you start working, that whole plan is going to be shredded. But you still have the North Star, that, ending point of that, 1 year, 2 year, 5 years, 4 years. And actually with this investment bank, we had a whole plan for the first 5 years, but in detail for the first 1 and 2. And the reality is that then you work on 2 week sprint, then you have to constantly readapt to whatever, priorities is at that point. But just also because you can operate in an island, you have to make sure that this thing plugs in the current work that these people are doing in the business as usual, right? So you need a great team, I can tell you that. And I actually changed quite a few people in my team in this program because when I'm able to do that, now we landed in the perfect team that I will never let go. You need a great team to be able to actually play multiple roles, to be able to cope with that level of uncertainty, to be able to craft the blueprint at the same time, to have a strategic conversation, and they can readapt the roles throughout. And what I tend to do to avoid, discomfort, changing process all the time, is to have people accountable and owning a specific stream of work. So I have a person that is fundamentally responsible for the whole instrumenting journey bit, a person that is responsible for anything related to operating model and governance, a person that is responsible for the whole bit on reusable standards. Now, might look like a siloed way of looking at this thing, then effectively it's their responsibility, and mine as a program manager, program lead, to ensure that, they have cross-pollination, that they understand where these things build on each other, right? And so once you've done that, then you can be very flexible in the way you reprioritize and go around your planning of the work.
Yeah, sure. That's great. Thank you so much.
I think the time is finished, but maybe I can just jump in for a very quick question. So my question, because these are, it's crazy to imagine that an organization asks for 3 months, such a change management project. And so somehow it's also a difficulty from organizations understanding probably the implications of this kind of changes, no? And for example, in Italy, there is this design agency called Logotel. Yeah. And they said that the problems is that they have short solution projects, so that they need to develop a new service, and then they need to establish a relationship with the company for a long term to be sure that the service is implemented, to deal with all the change management issues and so on. And that part is often not paid for, or it is paid in a maybe not in the right scale for the effort. So I was wondering, how do you how can you anticipate or communicate the kind of effort, and how do you establish the value for this kind of work, transformational work?
Okay, so from like talking specifically about this case, so we started with this like 3 months project as a demo. So the whole idea was to make them thirsty, basically. So okay. The idea was to show them what design can do, what service design can do, how like indeed these pilots would be implemented, and it worked because they came back to us yet again with another 3 months project. So what we're trying to do is like it is a sort of like bottom strategic work that you have to do. It's your homework, right? Is understanding if you're talking with the right people within the organization, or like who do you actually have to talk with. Is understanding whether your client, as in the role of the client, is what you need to make a more strategic discussion, or if you have to like look for a higher position, or it is a kind of like homework that you have to do yourself and invest in. And there's also a discussion around assessing the service design maturity or the customer centricity of this organization, because often I mean, customer centricity and service design are hype and cool, and then like want to buy the fun stuff, and they don't understand that behind it there's actually a thorough and complex work. So yeah, it's a matter of trying to like,
and that's one view on it, in the sense that this is one type of organizations, but that I think it's also a question of how you position yourself. So we are increasingly more moving from the Logotel model that looks at, we're going to be designing going to redesign your organization in order to enable you to do that service, right? And so when you move from service to organizational design, let's say by design, by service design, that it doesn't exist. I mean, this whole concept of you're not going to be here for implementation, it doesn't exist. If you are there, empowering them, enabling the piece of work to happen, they will design the service, but you're there to make sure that the funding is there. And so when you kind of are working on the plumbing, there is no scenario where you're not involved in that piece of work, right? And so I really agree with you, it depends on the maturity of the organization, and more we see clients coming with those kind of very structural questions. So we more and more move from a one-off project to years of relationships, and that is you can see from 5 years ago to now. I mean, I would say 60% of the work that we do now is really like longer relationships. It's absolutely no one-off, no more long-term planning.
Okay, it's an infinite conversation, but we can, we can stop it here, I would say.
Yeah. Thank you so much for speaking today, and we really appreciate this once again. I'll share this video on the website as well as the PDF. We'll update it very soon.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.